I'll never forget this night shift like I'll ever remember any other. It was just another long, grueling night in the operating room, but little did I know that it would be anything but ordinary. The hospital was quiet, except for the occasional beep of a machine or the soft murmur of a patient's labored breathing. My colleague, Rachel, and I were the only ones on duty, our eyes scanning the monitors as we went about our tasks with practiced ease. It was 2 a.m., and the darkness outside seemed to press in against the windows like a living thing. I found myself lost in thought, replaying the day's events in my head, when suddenly Rachel's voice cut through the silence. "Hey, have you seen the new patient?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I could have sworn he was here earlier. I checked the chart, but there was nothing on it. No name, no date of birth, just a cryptic notation that read, Patient X. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked up at Rachel. Something didn't feel right. "Let me check the cameras," I said, my heart beating slightly faster. The security footage showed a figure in a white coat entering the room just before midnight, but when I asked Rachel to describe him, she shook her head. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight with unease. I knew then that something was very wrong. "Rachel, look at this," I said, my voice low and urgent. The patient's chart had changed. A new name was listed, one that made my blood run cold. Elijah Winters. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see Rachel standing frozen in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "What is it?" I asked, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly backed away from the wall, her eyes never leaving some point beyond my shoulder. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. It was as if she'd seen something that made her question everything. And then, just like that, she turned and ran out of the room. I was left standing alone in the darkness, the only sound the soft hum of the machines and my own ragged breathing. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just a prank or a mistake, but deep down, I knew that something was very wrong. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease and focus on my tasks. It was just another day in the operating room after all. We had a steady stream of patients coming in for routine surgeries, and I was determined to get through the night without any major incidents. Rachel returned to the room, her expression still pale but her eyes focused again. Together, we went about our work, checking vitals, prepping instruments, and scrubbing in with our colleagues. The hospital was quiet, except for the occasional beep of a machine or the soft murmur of a patient's labored breathing. It was 3 a.m. now, and I was starting to feel like I was stuck in some kind of never-ending loop. Every time I thought things were getting back to normal, something would happen that would throw me off balance. A patient's heart rate would spike unexpectedly, or a piece of equipment would malfunction with no apparent reason. I wrote it off as fatigue, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Rachel and I exchanged brief glances, both of us knowing that something was off, but neither of us wanting to say anything out loud. The tension between us was palpable, like a living thing that threatened to consume us whole. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the task at hand, but my mind kept wandering back to Patient X and Elijah Winters. Who were they, really? And what did they want from me? As the night wore on, our shift began to feel more like a blur than a series of distinct events. We went through the motions, checking patients in and out, prepping for surgeries and scrubbing in with our colleagues. The hospital was quiet, except for the occasional beep of a machine or the soft murmur of a patient's labored breathing. I found myself lost in thought, replaying the events of the previous night over and over in my head. Was it really just a prank, or had something more sinister been at play? Rachel seemed distracted too, her eyes darting around the room as if she was waiting for something or someone. We exchanged brief glances, but neither of us said anything. The silence between us felt oppressive, like a weight that threatened to crush us. As the hours ticked by, I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. It started with small things: a door creaking open on its own, a faint whisper in the corridor outside our room, or the soft rustle of fabric as if someone was moving around the hospital without being seen. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew that something was amiss. And then, just as we were starting to get into a rhythm, the lights in the operating room began to flicker. Not hard enough to be alarming, but enough to make me feel like something was off. Rachel looked up from her chart, her eyes locking onto mine with a look of concern. "Do you see that?" she mouthed, her lips barely moving. I shook my head, and then the lights went out completely. The darkness was absolute, a heavy blanket that suffocated me. I stumbled forward, trying to find my way back to the monitor, but it was like navigating through a thick fog. Rachel grabbed my arm, her grip tight and reassuring. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our own ragged breathing. Slowly, we made our way to the wall, where I fumbled for the light switch. It took a few attempts before the fluorescent lights flickered back to life, casting an eerie glow over the room. We stood there, panting, as if we'd just run a marathon. The monitor was still dark, but I could see that patient X's vitals were still stable. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed quickly by a sense of unease. What had just happened? Had it been some kind of power outage, or was something more sinister at play? Rachel seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. "It started with small things," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Little anomalies that made us wonder if we were going crazy." She paused, glancing around the room as if she expected someone or something to leap out from the shadows. "Last night, you found a patient on the chart who wasn't there before. This morning, I saw something moving in the corner of my eye. And now we have the lights flickering like this." She trailed off, her eyes locked onto mine with a look of concern. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that Rachel was right. Something was very wrong. As the night wore on, our preparations for surgery began to take shape. We scrubbed in, donning our sterile gowns and gloves, and began to prep the patient's vitals. But something about it felt off. The medical equipment seemed different. The monitors beeped with a discordant rhythm that made my skin crawl, and Rachel's movements were stiff and jerky, as if she was being puppeteered by some unseen force. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just tired and stressed, but deep down I knew it was more than that. We began to make small talk, exchanging pleasantries about our weekend plans and family news, but it felt like a facade. Every so often, Rachel would glance at me with an unnerving intensity, as if she was trying to read my mind. "We're almost there," I said, trying to sound confident, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. The patient's vitals were stable, their heart rate steady, but something about it all felt off. It was like we were performing some kind of twisted ritual, one that went beyond mere medicine and into the realm of the unknown. And then, just as we were about to make the incision, I saw it. A small, almost imperceptible movement out of the corner of my eye. Rachel didn't seem to notice it, but I felt a jolt of adrenaline run through me. What was going on? Who, or what was behind this? The patient's vitals were still stable, their heart rate steady, as we continued with the procedure. But just as I was starting to feel a sense of normalcy, the anesthesia machine beeped loudly and the anesthesiologist rushed in to take over. "We need to transfer patient X to ICU immediately," he said, his voice urgent. Rachel and I exchanged a look, both of us knowing that this was not part of the original plan. We had been preparing for surgery, not an emergency transfer. The patient was wheeled out of the operating room and into the crowded corridors of the hospital, leaving me feeling disoriented and confused. As we walked, I noticed that the other doctors and nurses seemed to be avoiding eye contact with us. They whispered to each other in huddled groups, their faces filled with a mix of fear and suspicion. It was as if they knew something we didn't know. Rachel's hand found mine under the table, her grip tight and reassuring. "What's going on?" I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, her eyes darting back and forth. "I don't know," she said, "but I have a feeling that we're not out of this yet." We arrived at the ICU, where patient X was already being prepped for transfer. The anesthesiologist handed me a clipboard with the patient's chart, his face grim. "There's been a code red," he said. "The patient's vitals are spiking and we can't seem to stabilize them." I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I looked at the chart. What was happening? Why were patient X's vitals spiking? And what did it have to do with us? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as we followed the patient to room 304. The ICU was quiet, the only sound the soft beeping of machines and the gentle hum of the ventilators. We pushed open the door and stepped inside, our eyes adjusting to the dim light. The patient was lying on the bed, their vitals still spiking despite our best efforts to stabilize them. I began to monitor their chart, my eyes scanning the data for any clues as to what was going wrong. Rachel stood beside me, her gaze fixed intently on the patient's face, and then, without warning, she let out a soft gasp. "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing with anticipation. She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "The chart," she whispered. "Patient X. They're not who they say they are." I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked at the chart again. The patient's name was listed, but there was no birth date or social security number. It was as if they had just materialized out of thin air. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I realized the implications. Who was this person? And what were we doing with them? Suddenly, the patient's eyes flickered open and they sat up in bed, their gaze fixed intently on us. "You shouldn't have come here," they hissed, their voice low and menacing. Rachel took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But the patient just smiled, their lips curling up into a cruel grin. "You'll see soon enough." I watched in horror as the patient's smile grew wider, their eyes glinting with a malevolent light. Rachel took another step back, her hand grasping for mine like a lifeline. I felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins as I realized that we were in grave danger. The patient's gaze seemed to be hypnotic, drawing us in with an otherworldly power. I tried to tear my eyes away, but it was no use. The patient's smile grew even wider, their lips curling up into a grotesque parody of a grin. "You should have stayed out of this," they hissed, their voice like a snake slithering through the grass. Rachel's grip on my hand tightened, her fingers digging deep into my skin. I knew that we had to get out of there, and fast. But as I turned to make a run for it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The hospital room was empty, except for one person standing in the corner, watching us with an unblinking gaze. It was the hospital administrator, his eyes cold and calculating behind his mask of politeness. "I'm afraid you're not going anywhere," he said, his voice dripping with malice. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I realized that we were trapped. The patient's smile seemed to grow even wider, their eyes glinting with triumph. We were at the mercy of this twisted game, and I had no idea how to escape. I was searching for Rachel, but she was nowhere to be found. The hospital was in chaos, with doctors and nurses rushing to and fro, trying to make sense of the bizarre events that had unfolded. I stumbled upon a note on my desk, scribbled in haste. It read, "They've taken me. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th and Main." My heart sank as I realized that Rachel must have been taken by the same forces that had abducted patient X. I knew I had to act fast, but where was I supposed to start? The police were stumped, and the hospital administration seemed just as clueless. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed a set of keys from the nurse's station and set out to find the old warehouse on 5th and Main. As I arrived at the location, I noticed that it was abandoned and looked like it hadn't been used in years, but something about it felt off. The air around me seemed thick with an eerie energy, and I could have sworn I heard a faint whispering in my ear. I cautiously made my way inside, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space for any sign of Rachel or patient X. Suddenly, I heard footsteps echoing through the warehouse, growing louder with each passing moment. My heart racing, I prepared myself for what was to come. But as the footsteps stopped right outside the room I had been led to, I realized that I wasn't alone. I cautiously opened the door, my heart pounding in anticipation of what I might find. As I stepped inside, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. Rachel was standing in front of a large stone altar, her eyes black as coal and her skin deathly pale. She turned to face me, her gaze vacant and unblinking. "Welcome, Doctor." "Kim," she said, her voice low and husky. "I see you're late." I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The room was filled with an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to be drawing the very life out of me. Patient X was standing behind Rachel, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly energy. "What's going on?" I managed to stammer. "This is some kind of dark ritual," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Rachel laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "You're too late for that," she said. "The ceremony has already begun." Suddenly, the air was filled with a blinding flash of light, and I felt myself being drawn towards the altar. I tried to resist, but it was no use. The next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the altar, surrounded by the cult members who had been impersonating hospital staff. They were all dressed in white robes, their faces painted with symbols of ancient deities. The leader of the cult turned to me and began to chant in a language I didn't understand. As he spoke, the air around us seemed to grow colder, and I could feel the very fabric of reality beginning to unravel. This was it. We were about to unleash some kind of dark power upon the world. As the cult leader's chanting grew louder, I felt a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into my very bones. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy that made my skin crawl. Rachel, still under some kind of mind control, began to dance around the altar, her movements jerky and unnatural. Patient X watched from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. I tried to speak out against what was happening, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The cult leader raised his hands to the sky, and a blinding flash of light illuminated the room. When the light faded, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Rachel had transformed into a monstrous creature, her body twisted and distorted beyond recognition. Her eyes glowed with an evil intensity as she spoke in a voice that was not her own. "The ritual is complete," she hissed. "The darkness has been unleashed." Patient X stepped forward, their eyes fixed on me with a malevolent glee. "You should have stayed out of this, Dr. Kim," they said, their voice dripping with malice. "Now you'll join us in the abyss." As they spoke, the room began to distort and twist around me like a reflection in rippling water. I felt myself being pulled towards the altar, towards some kind of terrible fate that I couldn't escape. The last thing I saw was Rachel's twisted face, her eyes burning with an evil light as she whispered "welcome" in my ear. I found myself trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror and confusion. The cult members, now transformed into twisted, humanoid creatures, closed in on me from all sides. Patient X stood at their center, their eyes blazing with an otherworldly energy. I knew I had to think fast if I wanted to survive. I remembered the notes Rachel had left behind, cryptic messages that spoke of a hidden weakness in the cult's defenses. I focused all my energy on recalling them, trying to piece together the puzzle before it was too late. The creatures closed in, their jaws open wide, ready to strike. I raised my hands and a burst of adrenaline surged through me. "You can't hurt me," I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. "I know your secret." Patient X took a step forward, its eyes flashing with anger. "What are you talking about, Dr. Kim?" it growled. I took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everything. The ritual was never meant to summon something from another dimension. The creatures froze, their eyes darting nervously towards Patient X for a moment. I thought I saw a glimmer of uncertainty in its gaze, but then its expression hardened once more. "You fool," it spat. "You'll never escape the void." And with that, the room began to shudder and tremble. The air seemed to distort and ripple, like water being poured onto a hot surface. I stumbled backward, my heart racing with fear. Suddenly, the walls around me dissolved, revealing a vast expanse of nothingness. I was staring into the abyss, and it was staring back at me.